which itself is playful. Lekker is the generic term for good, nice, great, wonderful in the context of the vernacular of South Africa. So lekker design is all of that and more. It's a great pleasure. They're going to be talking about microspaces, microgeographies in Shanghai, which continue some of the themes that were brought up last week, no doubt. It's a great pleasure to have them both. They'll talk for about an hour. We'll take a break, come back for a discussion. Terrific.
So I think what we may do is just dim the lights because some of the slides, our lecture is heavily slide dependent, and a lot of the slides were taken in Shanghai at night, so they are dark. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to attend. The sessions have taken place already. We only flew in last night. But we're sure that many of the distinctive aspects of Shanghai and of the current wave of Chinese urbanization have been discussed. And like many, probably most of you, thanks. We've been interested in the massive upwelling of description and analysis of urban China. It's funny how the seemingly unprecedented scale and speed of this transformation is met with a similarly daunting body of writing, particularly in the design press and also in the popular media. And again, we're interested in the fact that a kind of a cool Hassian tone seems to be used very extensively in this discussion, which is to say we continue to read many accounts of contemporary China that are highly descriptive and perhaps more descriptive than they are actually analytical. These involve a kind of a poetics of the quantitative, high rates of construction, vast areas of urbanization, and enormous volumes of material. But in a sense, our focus is a little different with respect to China. We lived in Shanghai for about 18 months from 2002 to 2003, and we were living in the French concession, and our interest really grew in a very simple and organic way out of what we were seeing in our endless walks through the lanes. We spent most of our time in Shanghai walking. We were living in lane housing ourselves in a block from the 1930s, where in our flat, which was in the middle, there were 3 flats, ours was the second floor, was the only one that was restored to its original condition. Both the bottom floor and the top floor were home to many, many families. And there was a lot going on in this older fabric that was of interest to an architect, we felt, and a lot that also seemed very new, even though it was taking place in some of the oldest existing stock. And the aging buildings were suddenly developing new accretions, rooms in unexpected places, spaces subdivided in new and sometimes perverse ways, extensive rooftop landscapes, hidden businesses, parasitic and nodal infrastructures, just amazing stuff. And we started to get a sense that there was more of a story to tell here about urbanizing China, at least about an important Shanghainese case. So while most of the writing was focused upon large scales and high speeds and on highly formalized modes of construction, we became interested in investigating what was happening at the opposite end of the spectrum, those changes that were small scale, incremental, and working within low end and informal accommodations that were, to put it bluntly, often on the way out. This is a kind of a slide that beautifully illustrates the difference. This is in the Changning district. What you see behind are the old houses with all of their informal kinds of accretions and transformations, and in front a sign basically promising the beautification of the district, and a really nice little moment where they bring the plants from the signage out into the road to kind of complete this false perspective. But behind there's all of this stuff going on, and basically this stuff is demolished. But what we saw here was a very suggestive architectural situation. So while all of this grand scale of development was taking place, there was an enormous quantity of destruction also. And a great number of people have been forced to relocate their homes and businesses. You can see a little bit of that. This is in 2004, actually quite close to the Yuyuan tourist areas, but all this housing was being destroyed. And many of the people who are being located would obviously prefer not to be located, and definitely not to the deserts of Pudong. You know, they would rather stay within the city, and often within the same part of the city. And as a result, the remaining blocks begin to groan under a weight of ever-increasing human density and needs. And as a result, you get very innovative ways in which people manipulate their physical and social environment to accommodate a great diversity of requirements within an aging architectural frame. So for lack of a better phrase, we term this project microgeography. In part, this has to do with an analysis of small things, alterations and decorative choices and the like, almost the stuff of interior design. And we felt, among other things, that interiors were highly relevant in the Chinese case. But to these tiny things, we found ourselves applying the analytical tools of geography as a discipline, which, to be frank, is often concerned with the larger objects of study. And in the early days of the study, and prior to his sudden death a few years ago, Dennis Cosgrove at UCLA in geography was one of the people who was giving feedback and very much engaged with us in this discussion. But what the microscale implies here as well is an attention to detail, both on the part of the producers and on the part of the analysts. And this is very different from the architecture with a capital A that people currently automatically, perhaps too automatically, associate with contemporary China, or at least outside of China. These kinds of birds' nests and water cubes and other acts of architecture that are in many cases simply patterns that are made three-dimensional. They're endlessly repetitive, and for the most part, they're utterly scaleless. I think the building that's on the poster for this conference actually illustrates that problem incredibly well. But now, before we describe what follows, I'd like to define very clearly the limits of this work. As architects, we identified an area of space making that was happening in a very fleeting moment. We saw this as something worth documenting, both as forms, but also through interviews, in the words of the people who were making it. Likewise, we've attempted in the larger project, though we won't talk about it much today, to describe the social and historical infrastructures that make this type of informal urbanism possible. There was an architecture here that was not being authored by famous international architects or famous international companies either. Instead, it was being authored by anonymous individuals and groups. Again, we thought this was worth recording. And moreover, it was an architecture which, by all signs, was disappearing very quickly into a more formalized type of urbanism, either through destruction or through conservation, or through projects like Xintiandi, which are actually destruction pretending to be conservation. But we're not urban polemicists, and we're not going to make a case for this or that. That is, we're not going to make a Jane Jacobs-style argument that lane house innovations represent authentic architecture urbanism for Shanghai or for China, while other projects do not. Now, I think most people here will be familiar with the phenomenon of collectivization. And those of you who spend considerable time in urban China, well, we don't have to tell you, you've no doubt experienced collectivized spaces for yourselves. An architecture of subdivision emerged and enormous human densities, and this won't be new to you. Those of you who are from Shanghai, maybe you can go to sleep now. You're probably familiar with a lot of this. But events of the last years, we believe, have actually re-energized the process of collectivization. And here, a new wave of needs and programs, as well as an ever-increasing pressure on low-end housing, has caused the collectivization process to take on new burdens. So we felt that this was worth documenting, in particular because so much of this is temporary. And it's this temporariness that has allowed, in part, such an ability for people to renegotiate their surroundings. And sooner or later, most of the buildings that we've studied have actually been eradicated. Now, the history of collectivization is very important when we look for architectural innovations in the informal sector. And what's important to note about the legacy of collectivization is that ownership of much of Shanghai's old fabric was broken down to the scale of the single room. As we will see later, this is very important. It allows a great deal of manipulation to take place informally, as few permissions are required and few permissions are sought. And as we've found through interviews, neighborhoods and administrative groups, Danweis, former Danweis, lane committees, block committees, and so on, often assist in facilitating the sorts of transformations that often come with interventions in the existing fabric, especially as these inevitably increase pressures on available space and resources. The point is that there's a very fine scale of ownership and a history of collectivization which allows for negotiation among old and new neighbors. Now, in the current moment of the history of collectivization is combined with the logic of marketized real estate in new and dynamic ways. As I've mentioned, the lane house fabric that was ubiquitous as little as 3 decades ago has rapidly been disappearing. Through a process of negotiation, those who wish to develop these parcels have settled upon a price payable for the tenants to move away. And of course, the cost of living in a new condominium is often well out of range of those currently living in lanes, i.e. those being relocated. So the latter provide a very cheap and very central type of accommodation. And as it happens, a speedy and highly organized industry has emerged to deal with this problem. Shanghai is home to a great deal of small-scale construction in buildings and in landscape, and much of it is done by amateurs, by small contractors, and by people who are moving themselves. Do we have Mr. Zhang's work? Yeah, so here's an example. I love this example. This is a fellow named Mr. Zhang Weili. This is his workstation. He's a 54-year-old carpenter who lives and works in Huaihaifeng. And maybe some of you have been to Huaihaifeng, which is a network of lanes and lane houses that spans between Nanchang Road and Huaihai Road to the north. It's actually not too far from here. And it's a place that intersects our story in other ways in terms of our larger research, because Huaihaifeng became a major hub for fake goods shops, hidden fake goods shops after the old Shangyang market was destroyed a few years ago. Mr. Zhang has lived there all his life, and as such, he's one of only a handful of people who've done so. Most of his neighbors took advantage of the real estate reshuffle during the Cultural Revolution to move in. But this type of lane compound, and specifically Huaihaifeng in the 20s, was associated with well-heeled people. And Mr. Zhang himself only started working there after being made redundant in his late 40s when his danwei was resolved. And in order to make a living and to continue to occupy himself, he became a carpenter, drawing on 18 years of work experience. So he opened his own workshop, which you can see here, which actually is an open air workshop, and he claims that he can make anything out of wood. When we met him, he was making musical instruments. His workshop is delineated by this workbench that sits to one side of the main lane, and an exterior brick face of one of the lane houses is embedded with hooks from which he hangs various tools and work orders and so forth. And this workshop sits outdoors 365 days a year, even through the winter, which those of you who've suffered through a Shanghai winter, you know is quite something. The only time it relocates is when it's raining. And in this case, Mr. Zhang takes it all apart piece by piece and will patiently slide the component pieces and his wood siding through a narrow corridor come kitchen that is the only entrance to his house. And the entry corridor is occupied along one length by a sink, a cutting service, stove and fridge, and that sort of thing. So it leaves about 2 feet in which for him to maneuver all this stuff through. He also has a table saw here, so he's doing some pretty serious carpentry. But what we noticed was, in general, a kind of conservation of mass at work. And one of the remarkable things about Shanghai demolition we noticed was how incredibly orderly it was. Indeed, a huge amount of recycling was taking place, and often because wrecking balls and large-scale demo equipment could not get into the sites, a lot of the dismantling was being done by hand. These are, again, buildings that are in quasi-states of destruction. There's still people living in them. One of the extraordinary things about this moment in time was to see effectively ruins where one family that was holding out would occupy an upstairs bedroom and stop the process of destruction. And there was a very kind of haunting overlap between living, ongoing occupation, and demolition. So you can see here, just a couple more slides of that same area. You can see here, in fact, a kind of a ghost town effect of streets of houses where the facades are left, but everything else, including the roof, have been demolished, especially to avoid squatters coming in and taking over those houses after the original tenants have left. Please note what's going on here. I mean, this is where the demolition is taking place. These are bricks from what used to be the houses, which are then being stacked in the front and sold. The same thing happens with the wood. Okay, so, I mean, you can see sort of that a very common sight then, that waste is organized by type. It's cleaned and it's stripped and it's stacked and it's sold. And in most cases, you'll see that part of a demolition site or an area nearby is used as a sale area for materials that are being stripped and destroyed. In this case, ducting, an enormous quantity of ducting. So there's one case on Ulamuchilu. This was close to where we used to live. There was enormous clearing of both houses and also a small deco apartment blocks along this street. In fact, as you can see, if you were to see on the ground level here, it's basically all surrounded by hoarding, and they were slowly moving all of the residents out on a family-by-family basis. But the space is apocalyptic. It's like a scene from Gravity's Rainbow or something like that. The apocalyptic has something to do with the new buildings you can see in the back, which have this sheer and abstract, kind of abstract to the point of violence sort of quality to them. And the lanes were being destroyed. They're now completely removed and replaced. You can see that the lower scale housing in the front here, this was home to many, 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 many families, and is now a finished construction site. So what happened was actually quite organized. The destruction began at this end of the block and moved southwards. So the buildings were demolished, their pieces were gathered, treated, grouped into parcels, and sold in a room of the half-demolished building itself at street level. So you can see, as the sign here reads, basically you can buy old wood floorboards, practically right off the old floors that were being ripped out. And you can buy them at 10 o'clock at night if you like. It's highly organized, and we've interviewed some of the people undertaking this work. It's not a first-come, first-served situation. In fact, each district has a dedicated demolition company who will take over the site and also the selling of salvaged goods. So they're government companies, and the work is orchestrated. The wood sellers will pay a sum to the demolition company for the lot of wood. They'll then sort and sell it according to quality. They claim that this wood is not hard to sell on, except for the soft wood, what's called cheesy wood, wood that has holes. So good wood can cost as much as 400 RMB a piece, and bad wood can cost 400 by the truckload. So what you can see here is that this is now the uninhabitable ground floor of the destroyed former housing, and the wood shop is just to the left of the range of the slide. So the shop itself is very temporary, but what's admirable is the rate of recycling, which the demolition people average at roughly 50% of the materials of the original building that's being destroyed, which then go into circulation and are often used to customize remaining stock in areas nearby, which we'll see in a moment. But we see the same thing here also on Madanglu. This is very close to Xintiandi. The building is being demolished, and the wood is actually being passed through a portion of the old facade in some cases, stored on this roof. So this is the area that's being destroyed behind. It's being passed through the facade as it's destroyed. Clean, stacked, ordered, and sold on the right side. So in some cases, it's stored on the roof, and then the space where a grouping of housing was destroyed becomes a temporary lumberyard, in effect. So what happens? All of these materials go in circulation. A lot of the population that are relocated try and find new housing or new places in old housing. So what we get is a kind of very surprising architecture. And this is the setting. There are people moving, materials moving, and families are trying to resettle into a fabric that was pushed beyond its maximum many years ago. This building is still here. This is quite alarming. This was a house, a beautiful old Art Deco house that was destroyed, and they decided to use the front facade as hoarding for new construction that was going to come up behind. So there's sort of literally the site of the old ruin in the front and the new, much spiffier housing coming up behind it. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, there's a kind of an orderliness or a sense of social administration to a lot of this. And there tend to be typologies that define the kind of architectural interventions that occur. Yeah, it would be a bit better. But it's worth pointing out here that the result is a very surprising type of urbanism, surprising architecture and surprising interiors. We find that many surfaces have been subjected to an inventive process of thickening, with new functions expanding what used to be a facade or a street wall, or new additions and alterations, very extensive gardens on roofs and so forth. So the first of the general kinds of operations that we're talking about, we call it flattening. We don't have a great term for it yet, but we'll use that for now. But I'd like to give you a couple of examples of this in situ. Mai is a 44-year-old domestic worker. She was born and raised in Shanghai's French Concession. She's been living in an apartment at Xizang Nanlu with her husband and daughter since the spring of 2000. The Ma family relocated here after their previous home fell within the construction path of Xintiandi. But where Xintiandi was described as a kind of contextual, pedestrianized retail environment, several hundred families, such as Mai's, were actually relocated to other apartments in the old city fabric along the peri-urban fringe. Their former room is actually now a tree planter bordering an artificial lake that was designed by landscape architect Peter Walker. Mai was paid 200,000 RMB to relocate quietly. She spent half of this sum for her new room, which has to be vacated or was vacated in early 2005 for yet another construction site. Spiraling land prices and the dwindling stock of affordable housing means that she's likely to be forced to move to one of the windswept new suburbs, a move that she's understandably putting off for as long as possible. Her current home is a lane house on the second floor of a wing behind the main road. In a typical manner, you can sort of see the way that it's laid out here. This is actually the entrance to her house from a sort of a common stair. Her home is in this one room, and they also have access to, or at least visual access to, a kind of exterior roof space, which I'll show you a bit about in a moment. There's actually a second room, which has been inserted just below the stairs in a sort of fairly uninhabitable space, which is the daughter's bedroom. In a typical way, the brick row houses of her neighborhood are arrayed in terraces along a tight bronchial network of secondary and tertiary lanes. The entrance is narrow and dark, with a sink and a makeshift stove along one side. And there's a steep stair, a very steep stair, with an approximate 2-to-1 slope, which leads upwards from the front door. And it winds tightly along the southern party wall of the building. At each landing, and again at the base in the attic, doors lead into adjacent rooms. 8 families share this 3-story stack with a footprint of less than 400 square feet per floor. Until recently, all 3 members of Mai's family shared a single room of 20 square meters. This is an elevation of her room. Part of the ongoing work of our project, obviously we're taking a lot of photographs and doing a lot of interviews. We're also, with the help of students from Tongji University, doing a series of architectural survey drawings of Shanghainese interiors, and this is one. This is basically a cross-section through her apartment looking at her world of objects, which it turns out to be a very important thing. Her daughter formerly slept in this alcove at the base of the stairs, actually in the common area in the foyer of the Lane house at the base of the stairs I showed just now. She soon moved upstairs because a broken manhole cover at the front door sent a steady stream of mice running over her bed, especially during the winter and summer rainy seasons. So she spent several months sleeping on the floor beside her parents' bed until the Ma's came to an agreement with an elderly couple downstairs to allow the building of a sleeping loft in their room, which was accessed through a very small hatch in the stairway. The single rectangular room of the Ma home has a door in one corner and a large window letting in light from the opposite side. This is the side with the door. This is the side with the window. This is her bed. This is desk. And the daughter used to sleep here next to the bed. And the daughter's room here, as you can see, this is the height of a normal room. This is the height of the daughter's room. It's about between 3.5 and 4 feet tall. This is an existing room, and they basically borrowed this space by building it in, and it's accessible off of the side of the staircase. A queen-size bed in Mai's room is positioned near the door, and a dining table was placed under the window. The floor is bare apart from a few sisal rugs, and furniture is arrayed along the 2 longer walls parallel to the sides here. And what's immediately striking about this room is the sheer proliferation of furniture and household objects. One could imagine a condition of discomfort or of paucity, but actually it's completely the opposite. The Ma home is replete with a full set of voluminous mahogany furniture and bourgeois decorative trappings of all kinds. There's a double bed, a wardrobe, a dressing table, a dining table, television set, refrigerator, microwave oven, rice cooker, and water cooler and heater. There are 10 bird cages of various sizes, of both fighting and singing species, a large fish tank, and a large collection of bonsai trees as well. Cabinets and bureaus line the walls on 3 sides. A hanging velvet scroll depicts the Golden Gate Bridge in metallic thread. Mai has relatives in San Francisco. And opposite, a ceramic Uyghur camel is perched on a stereo speaker. In addition, there are meticulously arranged memorabilia, photographs, letters, books, newspapers, magazines, and a decorative chadzi, a kind of a tea side table, contains a collection of teapots and cups. The Ma home looks to the outsider pretty much as if the trappings of a large Chinese middle-class homestead have been compacted into the space of a single tiny room, only 200 square feet. The plenitude is fairly overwhelming, and it strikes you orally as well as visually, in that Mr. Ma's pride is a collection of fighting crickets arrayed beneath the furniture and noisy phalanxes of ceramic pots. At its height, actually, this collection numbered over 100 fighting crickets. At Mai's insistence, it was recently culled to approximately 60. And even more striking than the accumulation of these objects we felt is their degree of organization. It initially seems inchoate, but the more you look at it and the more we spoke to her, we see that these things are meticulously choreographed in a series of telescoping scales. The largest of these scales involves the distribution of objects into broad domestic categories. The more traditionally private or back-of-house conveniences are arranged unexpectedly near the entry door. You can see here, this is where cooking, sewing, and a lot of sort of domestically associated functions take place. The cabinetry along this wall contains items of food and cooking as well as sewing, mending, and clothes. Rice cooking and microwaving takes place in this part of the room. The stove itself actually stands in their shower, which is in a 3x6 bathroom on the stair core. Most food items are concealed in boxes and Tupperware, except for a single glass enclosed shelf that houses Mai's favorite crockery and ornamental items and kind of allows her to display those things. The middle portion of the room, which is dominated by the bed, which is really a very large bed, carries many of the functions of the bedroom. The bureau and cabinets here contain family photographs, letters, and souvenirs, and in a very familiar way, the television sits at the base of the bed. By contrast, the far portion of the room, this here, and again, this is where the window is, it seems to be declared as social space. This area is dominated by a table upon which there's frequently a fruit bowl. It's surrounded by several small stools. There's also this is where the area for animals are, with the fish tank, bird cages hanging and also stacked in a shelving unit, and crickets placed on the floor. Most significantly, this portion of the room is home to an interesting false garden. The uninhabitable roof area beyond the window has been converted into a series of planting terraces by Mr. Ma. Bonsai of various sizes, which are, besides the cricket, his pride and joy. They've been placed along the windowsill and on wooden boards that stretch 3 meters to the parapet of the roof below. It provides a sort of picturesque impression of a miniature forest. The trees cascade backwards, elevated in the foreground and distance, while the middle ground is dropped below the level of the sill. The overlapping composition of objects, plants, trees, and suspended bird cages creates a pleasing illusion of depth. The appearance of a garden that is, in material fact, actually a deteriorating stretch of polyurethane waterproofing. The organization of Mai's single room into subrooms is accomplished through a form of projection. As in the traditional construction of perspective views, in which the plan and contents of a three-dimensional space are projected onto a picture plane, Mai's room recasts a series of proto-spatial organizational orders of objects and their associations onto vertical surfaces. The visitor can clearly identify the location of a kitchen, a bedroom, a living room, or a public area, and a garden. And the contents of these rooms function as signals in this projection. So the objects are stacked high in their cabinets and their containers, and their identifiable elements such as pots, pans, vacation photographs, and seasonal decorations render Mai's interior organization legible as a domestic order. Intentionally or not, this composition forms as a kind of scenographic device. It appears miraculously as if there are several discrete zones within the single room. And these carry the sense of a subdivision where none actually physically exists. There's a back-of-house space in the form of a kitchen, a bedroom, and a public space, and a garden that seem quite distinct from one another when you inhabit the room itself. The position of these subrooms are not coincidental. In fact, the public room is clearly positioned to take advantage of the view and the light from the false garden. The Ma home to us shows the continued relevance of the designed or decorated interior, especially in the absence of volumetric definition. I'll talk about this in a moment. But it's a sort of pictorial architecture. Space is either borrowed from outside or it's implied, that is, relationally ordered and articulated through the projection of an object world onto its walls. In a similar manner to Venturian postmodernism, the tectonic significance of plan and section are here replaced by articulate elevations, in effect. That is, the organization and micromanagement of objects and their connotations assist the subdivision of spaces, adding narrative and iconography. So the organization of things, their zoning along vertical surfaces, allows the miniature interior to be more than just a reduction. These objects have been subjected to a rigorous regime of stacking and ordering, and spatialization here has been replaced by something like microspatialization. And it's funny, in 2003, we took Robert Venturi around Shanghai and tried to arrange some visits and show this sort of thing to him. And very foolishly, we thought that the reduction of space to articulate surfaces would interest him. He was very polite, but he mainly wanted to take pictures of neon signs. Especially the Bayer sign on the Bund was particularly exciting for some reason. It was a failure to communicate. But what we're seeing in Shanghai is commonly the architecture of the single room. The question we've been asking ourselves as architects and as, budding geographers, if there's such a thing, is can there be such a thing as an architecture of the single room? And in so many cases, the experience of collectivization has meant that multiple occupants live within a single spatial envelope, often a room. Now, this may seem obvious, but it's actually a very serious matter. If your kitchen, bedroom, living room, or at least their functions and accoutrements are reduced to a single space, what do you do? How do you make architecture after volumetrics? How do you make architecture after space? As it turns out, people like Mai do so very articulately. But the role of objects in furnishing is very important here. And we see something very similar in the case of Mr. Mok. This is him. Mr. Mok comes from a wealthy Cantonese family, but he's actually lived in Shanghai his entire life. In fact, he's lived in the same building. He was born into the building that you see behind him. He's a very genteel, spry older man. Unfortunately, he's no longer alive. He was a Tai Chi enthusiast, and you can sort of tell he has a sort of graceful movement where it really looks like the Qi is flowing correctly somehow. He's very, very handy with a sword. He also speaks 6 languages, including English and Japanese, fluently. He was a subject of an unfortunate series of events. However, he was actually working as an attaché for the US Navy shortly before the revolution, a job that you did not want. And prior to this, the municipal police under the British. He was basically a forensic crime photographer. He photographed foreign dignitaries. He photographed the Emperor of Japan and Chiang Kai-shek. And he was also dispatched to photograph these infamously grisly Shanghai gangster crime scenes in the late 1930s. But when this was discovered later, he was actually issued a dictum banning him from productive work until further notice. This was in 1949, and he was restricted to city limits, and he had to inform the authorities every time he moved. So in fact, Mr. Mok has not worked since he was 30 years old, and when we met him in 2004, he was 88. So this is the major defining event of his life, and he still has his paper form banning him from work, which he shows you very quickly after you meet him. But his family used to own an entire compound of housing in this area, including this building, a small 2-floor structure fronting onto the road. And during the Cultural Revolution, rooms were incrementally given to other families until he was left with one, a back room on the first floor accessible from the lane. And his interior is actually fascinating. This is the entry from the lane. This is a sort of washstand area. Like Mai's house, it's also highly organized into areas. He is a very decorative character, and a lot of his space has to do with the local organization of what are effectively installations of interest to him. There are labels on everything, yeah. He has very eccentric labels. And this is a collection of globes. He's fascinated with globality. Actually, he introduces himself to lots of people in the park, especially foreigners, and as a result, he has this enormous book of postcards that people send him from all over the world, and he corresponds with these people. But he loves plastic flowers. He has a huge plastic flower and globe collection that is kind of marshaled together in this corner of the room. Like as in Mai's case, also there's a lot of retractable furniture. So his dining and mahjong table is pushed to the side, and then a lot of his items are pushed in here. He makes use of the depth of wall to put a fridge. He has part of his washing machine is sort of pushed back, and above this is a shrine. And then above this, a lot of the Shanghai buildings traditionally have a piano nobile at the ground floor, which means that they can take advantage of a bit more height. What's interesting is that he's actually decorated this insertion of a bedroom, which is quite a deep space and goes outside the envelope of his room into the unit behind. He's decorated it with wallpaper, with these grapes, with paintings that he likes that have, he was given them by the artist and so forth. So he's very, very careful about declaring different rooms. As his life has been reduced to one room, he's made multiple rooms within his one room. This is his shrine. It has a lot of, of course, images of his wife who passed away. She predeceased him by about 10 years, but also a lot of just kind of shrine type of contents.
Yeah, and a pithy saying that it says the air is polluted. Please don't smoke. Like it's a public room.
There's a closer view of the inside. Mr. Mok again. This is his couch with his tiger. This is the sort of his entertainment space. And behind him, he has a whole series of photographs of himself and his wife at various stages in their lives. And mainly what he likes to do is when he tells his story is very much about the story of his marriage. And he obviously makes use of these photographs to describe it. But he was a very talented photographer, and his pictures of his own family are beautiful. You can see here the ladder that goes up to the bedroom space, which is actually as deep as the main room. It goes back a long way. He has a kind of a fake fish tank here and clocks, and he loves boats. You can sort of see the plan here. This is the ground floor. Actually, there's a slight dislocation here. This line of the wall of the ground floor is actually the line where the beginning of his sleeping loft exists. So actually this line is over here. So it's as if two rooms have been kind of sheared. The upper room, which you cannot stand up in, it's way too low. It's about a 3-foot high space, has a bed, it has a small desk, and it has areas for all kinds of things that he needs once he gets up the ladder. You can see it here. He also has a bird cage there and some lights. And this is the main room. This is a cross-section in the other directions. You can see there's a chair. There's a desk, which you can't actually access the top, but he accesses the side, and then his bed and fan. As I said, there are a lot of interesting kind of personal labeling that goes on in his area. I mean, it's very interesting that a man who hasn't worked for 68 years, or 58 years rather, has time as money. A lot of his statements are about time and fleeting time. He's acutely aware of his own age, even though he's incredibly long-lived, and his boat. Okay. So Mr. Mok's approach to the interior is highly personal. In fact, as you can see, it's slightly eccentric. His home is a museum of personal meanings. And this is why we see so many objects out in decorative or scenographic placements, inscriptions, postcards, photographs, references to the zodiac are everywhere as well. But his home is somewhat like Mai's in that he has zoned the interior into discrete areas that stand in lieu of rooms. The loft, which is defined by wallpaper and paintings, the living room, which makes use of photographs to tell his personal narrative, and which Mr. Mok uses as a prop to tell people about himself. So with this in mind, we'd like to show you another type of transformation that's common. This is, in fact, a slightly different approach. We call this infilling, again, for lack of a better word. We'll come up with cool terminologies for these at some point. But these are the processes by which buildings, whether singular or part of a fabric, are actually reconsidered as a malleable frame, in which new architectural matter and new spaces can be inserted or broken off or considered separately from the whole. And the purpose of these undertakings is generally to provide new rooms for inhabitants, for the expansion of currently dwelling families, or to add new functions such as businesses and shops. So for example, the insertion of a new room into an already full plan, while changing or compromising as little of the existing rooms as possible. This was a case where ducks were being dried. As you can see, I mean, what starts to happen is that especially the street fronts and the alleyway fronts start to thicken out with all kinds of spaces that happen, obviously social gathering areas, but also new kinds of buildings and accretions that cantilever out into the street. And here, I mean, there's just, as you can see, an amazing scale. I mean, try to identify a facade, like a frontal facade in this photograph. There's none. I mean, what's happened is that all of these building frontages have been used with various forms of embellishment to provide new kinds of amenities. In this case, the insertion of a bathroom to the exterior and a wash area. Again, this is just an extension of that space. These buildings are all demolished now, by the way. And in some cases, what we see is something like a telescoping of rooms, where one window serves two or more stacked rooms behind a single facade. So as you can see, this is a fruit stand, right? They're taking advantage of the piano nobile space, and she has constructed a window here which serves a loft, and behind the loft is a bedroom. So unlike any of these kind of standard Western modes of organization where you either have rooms leading off of a corridor or older rooms like enfilade, one out of the next, actually you have a series of rooms that are stacked behind the facade, getting increasingly little light as they go back, which radically changes the possibilities of organizing the plan. In addition to that sort of approach, we also find bubbles and boxes. This is a different fruit shop. Apparently fruit shops are kind of an area of experimentation architecturally. But like Mai's daughter in the Stair, what they basically done is insert a sort of a cabinet / sleeping space inside a very, very narrow space. And here a smaller volume is placed as one might place a cabinet or a large piece of furniture. And interestingly though, the interiors are often treated as rooms, not as boxes. They have calendars, wallpaper, and furniture even. If the interior size can preclude standing up physically or spreading out, nonetheless the furniture gets put in. So another compelling example of this, maybe just to describe it to you, is actually a bathtub. This would be an interesting problem for architecture students, is how do you put a bathtub into a room which by the fact of overcrowding has become a kitchen and a corridor for 5 families. And here the tub is in effect at the center of the circulation core of the house. You can see this is the tub that I'm talking about here, which exists in a kind of a small room. Different families in all of these rooms, and this is their shared kitchen space, and there's one window right here. So not an easy problem to solve. And to make matters more complex, there is that only one window, although there's a high ceiling, and that helps to some extent. This is a great building. It's a sort of a huge extended complex of rooms with many families staying in it. It's a bit of mental math, just to keep it straight, but it's basically a beautiful neoclassical mansion that was owned by an early movie mogul. Both the building and the surrounding grounds were collectivized by a single danwei, which is still administering the building as of 2004. There's a bicycle and a metalworks repair business along one side, and also a sort of mini nursery. But this was a huge house that was clearly built for a single domestic family. The choreography of privacy in the rooms relies on a single domestic unit, not multiple families. And this is why it's so interesting to see the insertion of multiple family homes into it. The meeting of a mansion, the meeting of a mansion planned partially in enfilade, that is with intervening rooms, and the multifamily dwelling creates some serious problems, obviously. I won't explain the whole house, but I just want to talk about the tub. This is the kitchen. This is the toilet, which has thankfully been put against the facade, although maybe a bit too close to the cooking facilities. But the tub sits here inside a sort of open box that has many operable surfaces. What's happening here is we're walking toward that facade of the kitchen from the main foyer of the house. The bathtub is to the side here. And all along the way are storage of people's items. There's tremendous overcrowding in this building, so there's a lot of closet space, but also cooking preparation areas for the kitchen, which is generally kept clean. You can see the bathtub here. We're approaching through that main space into the kitchen. You see the bathtub on the right. Here we're actually in the bathtub looking through a window that has been placed in the bathtub cubicle. What's very interesting here, I mean, it's maybe for those of you who are familiar with Pierre Chareau with the glass house, there's this incredibly intense use of movable components to articulate very minor differences between public and private. So when one family is currently inside this area, and there is one family whose door is right here, the window will commonly be left open so that light can get into the bathtub. But if more than one family are occupying the space at the same time, then the windows and the doors are closed. These are the windows, again, looking across to the toilet and the cooking space to the right. And of course, there's the problem of water. I mean, who pays for the water, hot water and cold water? Where does it come from? In this case, it's multiply supplied by several different sources, and there are 3 taps and also one on the other side. So that is the kind of insertion we see, a kind of an operation where existing space is infilled with new kinds of spaces. Another way that this is done is through the insertion of a half floor. Sometimes taking advantage of this piano nobile, the extra height, but often these are inserted in such a way as to make the two resulting spaces greatly compressed. And in some cases, these are intended, like lofts, only to be slept in or sat in. On the face of it, this might resemble a simple sleeping loft, and these definitely exist. But what's interesting about additional rooms inserted at half floors is that only a proportion of them are actually sleeping spaces. We've seen living rooms with couches which can only be inhabited while sitting down, or rooms for the disabled or elderly in wheelchairs where the inhabitant can occupy the space because he or she is unable to stand up. Greg Girard, many of you must know who he is, a photographer, has visited the example of the latter where elderly disabled are actually parked inside a subdivided garret, which they never leave, and people visit them via a staircase. So this is a kind of a seemingly unthinkable operation in the West, I think, according to architectural conventions, which a room which purpose-built for sleeping and resting is actually too low for one to stand up in. These take away, but in a way they also add. I mean, what's lost in height is reclaimed in floor area, which is perhaps more valuable in the current market climate. Although, of course, the inhabitation is difficult. And sometimes these half floors can be totally hidden. They exist within the mass of the building independently from a facade. So what we saw earlier with Mai's daughter's room inserted halfway up the stairs in an upper corner of somebody else's room would be an example of that. We often see cases of subdivision along a window. The window, obviously, as a precious resource, is often where you negotiate the datum line of a new floor that's being added. This is an existing window that was this height. This is its original sill. This room has been divided into an upper room and a lower room with separate operable windows. So the windows effectively butterflied into 4 distinct components, just so that the above and below could get light from that single source. It's potentially dangerous to kind of add new spaces where no windows exist. So the existing window becomes an anchor around which this happens. Another case we see, which is very interesting and very common, are doorway mini buildings. You all must have seen some of these. These can be a barber shop, a tailor, chuan dasher, which is like a kind of guard post, a public toilet, or a refuse area. But these are different in that they have an exterior. Often they have a notional facade, windows, and locking mechanisms of their own. You can see this here, for example. This is one of our favorite cases, again, destroyed, but a very beautiful, clearly defined doorway in which a room has been inserted in the middle of the doorway. I mean, this was the doorway that was supposed to give a kind of grand entrance to the building, and these two sides now actually serve a private residence with 2 families, whereas those who live upstairs make use of the leftover third of the door. You can see that. This is how it used to be. This is after it has been filled in. The door on the left is central access, the one on the right to a room. But as you can see here, there's a complete dislocation between the plan and the elevation. I mean, this is the plan. That original doorway is given by these 2 red lines. So see if you can find a clear resemblance between what was and what is. Here's through the main door. Again, this leads up into a central stair core, which accesses many rooms above. Here's a case in which a small shop has been inserted into the doorway. You can see that here. Often there seems to be a knowledge that what do you need for a doorway? I mean, all these grand old world Shanghai doorways, which were 8 feet wide, 10 feet wide. Now people say, okay, 3 feet wide is enough. We have space here. Let's build something. This is a very beautiful case in which the inside outside, and it's an open space, is expressed with a kind of a coffered ceiling in a neoclassical style, and then a small guard post, which has become a business subsequently, has been inserted in. You can see that here with its cooking facilities and so on. This is actually very close to Mr. Mock's house. This is a barber shop that has been inserted into a doorway. The doorway itself is not very large. You can tell by the scale of the bicycle. This is the barber shop, and this is a loft above the barber shop where the barber sleeps. You can see it here. Here's his shop. Here's a very steep staircase, and then a sleeping area. Here he is. There are actually 2 barbers on duty. This guy was taking a nap. His friend was actually cutting hair at the time, his staircase. And a very compressed space, but with everything you need. Yeah, you can sort of see the character. It's very, very, very bright light from the street and his building to the side. And then his partner here was giving a haircut on the other side of the post. This is just an image of the plan. Here is the barber shop. This is the chair where hair was being cut. This is where the fellow was taking a nap. This is the stairs up to the top. And the whole thing is, this is the size of a door, right? So it's been compressed in this size, and that's actually Mr. Mok's apartment. Just a section through it. So what we see, it kind of allows for a lot of flexibility, and a similar logic is used also for the accretion of new buildings at edge spaces. And at street side accretions as well, like here where a kind of a seamstress, a sewing and repairs business, and a kitchen have been added. Here, a bicycle shop. It's actually a temporary bicycle shop that's open during certain hours, but everything has been set up on hooks so that the fellow can grab everything and clear it away when he needs to leave, because there are no lockup facilities. This is one of your 1,000 classic fake DVD shops that springs up. Actually, the owners have this flat, and they bring everything out to the street corner, just to the mouth of the lane in the evening, and then at about 11 o'clock at night, they move it back. But we used to come here, actually, because our house was just a little bit further down this lane. Or areas for drying, which, of course, as you've seen, is a major marshalling of resources. In this case, the residents had actually built formal metal poles along the sidewalk space in order to provide themselves areas to hang. In this case, a less formalized condition. In this case, a restaurant. This was, at the time the photo was taken, a very new and ritzy building. And they had their garden of Japanese style down here put in, and they were using the bamboo tree hoists in order to hang the various face cloths for the restaurant. But very often the small restaurants and street side food places will occupy this narrow space between the building facade and the street. This is sort of an amazing phenomenon. It's the inhabitable signboard, which we notice coming up. This is actually the face of the building is back here. And the signboard, the construction of the signboard has been built in such a way that people can sleep inside, and that the signboard itself has windows. Get a bit of a closer view there. This was one of the most extreme cases. This is actually a signboard. There's somebody sleeping inside. This is his window. There's a kind of a beautiful conflation of old and new Shanghai, maybe, or new and new Shanghai, where this is, obviously, we've all seen this driving along the Yan'an Expressway. This is the kind of wish image of the city springing up magically, and then a little hole in that image is the window provided for the person who's sleeping behind. It's an axonometric of that. This is a kind of a similar condition, but they actually become sort of like small outrigger buildings. And actually, one has to, as an architect, understand that the structural creation of these in very, very old brick walls, which have often turned to a mud-like consistency, is not an easy technical feat, among other things. So this allows for a tremendous flexibility, and moreover, it's at an interesting crossroads in architectural logic. I mean, new spaces are neither formalized nor are they aesthetically regulated. That is, they're not subject to cultural rules that would have the buildings remain properly or appropriately unified in a kind of a conventional sense. So I'm referring to here that body of thought that would dictate that the building has to appear tidy, families must inhabit identifiably bounded units with clear public and private distinctions, and so forth. But the changing Shanghai fabric is nonetheless structured by a traditional urban form. That is, they're not nearly as messy. I don't want to use this in a pejorative sense, but if you think about people's conceptual perceptual reaction to this kind of accretion versus, say, shanty towns in a Brazilian favela or in Lagos or in the Cape Flats, that these operations are part and parcel of a specific miniaturization process that Shanghainese sites appear to be experiencing. So here, new mass is added with a minimum of actual expansion, because in most cases, the exterior envelope is already established. These are transformations within existing buildings. All the expansion happens through a kind of a fractal process of subdivision, interpolation, and complication. And as more people and more materials are redistributed among a dwindling number of buildings, these operations become critically important. In a way, this is the inverse or complementary formal process to that which occurs at Mr. Mok's, for example. In those cases, the three-dimensional is flattened onto surfaces, but here the surface becomes quasi-three-dimensional. It's occupied and invested with all manner of program, person, and object. This is interesting in light of past theories of the facade as a surface, of course. Here the facade is a thick zone, although it's continually seen and continually communicates. It's not merely designed as a representation of the contents of the building. In some ways, it solves the quasi-singularity of the facade as an element, which has been a bugbear for architects for how many hundred years, as a sort of alien piece that's fundamentally different from the interior, yet intimately related to its contents. So these kinds of processes of stuffing, cutting, subdividing radically expand the possibility of a building, both formally and organizationally. As the latter are fragmented, the logic of the whole is transformed completely. And buildings are within themselves micromanaged and liberated, recreated, and reiterated at multiple scales. And localization leads to a sort of fission whereby a building becomes a kind of an urban district in and of itself. So the insertion of new volumes within existing volumes changes the model of architectural growth from accretion, or traditional space planning, into a sort of insertive model of building development. So just by way of conclusion, or a last example, let's look at this logic in a larger instance of what it's capable of architecturally. The above are instances. They're local demonstrations of ideas, but what might a building look like, if we could call it such, if it took advantage of these spatial methods? This is a restaurant called Baoluo. I don't know, has anybody here eaten there before? It's a very famous Shanghai restaurant. And it's a very, very unusual restaurant, which shows an unconventional way of composing the architectural object. It's a very, very organic mode of growth, a slow and continual expansion that takes place on a room-by-room basis. The legacy of collectivization is such that Baoluo can grow in such a manner. In fact, the owners and managers can renegotiate with their neighbors through a kind of particularistic contracting, which is a process that's been going on for 13 years. So what you see here is, when you go and see the restaurant on the street, it's this. It's a very small two-story building with a small third-story box built on top. It's a little bit like the TARDIS, for those of you who watch Doctor Who, in that you go in and all of a sudden the space on the inside appears to be bigger than it is on the outside. But the company, Baoluo, is actually a holding company with two businesses. It has a restaurant and a tire company. The owner started off fixing motorized bicycle tires and gradually expanded toward car tires. There are still two tire shops. One of which is down the road from the restaurant. The restaurant was opened in 1992 in the owner's house on Fuminglu. This is a drawing of that facade. Was the owner's house. The restaurant started up here and then eventually moved down. The owner bought the house and lived in it and then converted it into a restaurant. It's a very tiny house with a footprint of not more than 400 square feet and 3 stories tall. The restaurant used to be on the top floor, and the kitchen and bathroom was on the ground floor, and it started with only 3 tables. But in 1994, due to their excess, they expanded. They moved backwards away from the main road. They knocked through the back wall of the house and built out into the lane progressively this way. The main road is on the left. Actually, this house was built at the mouth of a set of gardens that alternate with the lane houses. And this area is composed of alternating rows of houses in their front gardens. And the houses are in a sort of a dumbbell configuration that look like 2 houses stuck together, but are actually 4 houses with load-bearing party walls. They were initially built and lived in by French, probably from the 1930s. The small buildings that now front onto Fuminglu were added on later to the ends of these row houses and in their gardens. So when they expanded, they did so eastwards, toward the back of the house, and into the garden area, and then northwards until they hit the row houses. So in this way, they broke into the first house in the row of 4 through a perspex-covered corridor, which actually is linking 2 separate buildings with some storage capacity on one side. The kitchen was housed in this extension into the garden. Row House 1 then became the first real expansion in seating capacity. The ground floor of these buildings have rather high ceilings, probably about 15 feet. They took over the ground floor of row house number 1, while above them continued to live several families. Now, to this day, there are still 4 unrelated families living in there. In fact, you can see a sign in the lobby. This is in the lobby of the restaurant. It's also the front door to a house with 4 families, and the sign basically says, there are people living here, please be quiet. We actually asked the managers, how does this work? I mean, they have to enter and leave through your restaurant. He said, it doesn't matter because the restaurant's open 24 hours. Which is a startling response. But all in all, there are 180 employees at this restaurant, and each one of them has to have a locker. And these are spread out in various empty spaces and nooks and crannies in the lane. Now, the second major expansion, and it was a very major expansion, was in 1998. And at this time, they bought over the rooms of 70 families who were living in the remaining 3 row houses. They gave them between 50,000 and 100,000 renminbi apiece to relocate, depending on the size of the room. Mr. Wang, who's the manager of Baoluo, says that this actually took very little time. A grand stair was constructed in the back half of the row houses. You can see it here. The back area contains a staircase with 2 rooms off of the landing. The floor-to-floor height in the back area is normal. It's around 10 feet. So the front of house has a floor-to-floor of around 15 feet. That used to be the grand living room for one of the various houses that was there originally. And this has been preserved in the restaurant. Mostly the common eating areas are on the ground floors, and they seem to become increasingly private as you move up. There are private rooms off the stair landings, which roughly correspond to the original rooms of the house. The second floor is composed of larger rooms and smaller, more private ones at the edges. The third floor is basically an attic, completely buried in the sloping roof, which used to be used for storage. And there's now a capacity for over 500 guests with over 70 tables. And on a regular day, this tiny, well, formerly tiny building feeds 2,000 guests. To the north, they have a shack which houses their workshop, four full-time staff, bandsaw welders, etc. So the restaurant is actually, it's prepared for growth at any moment. These workmen take care of all the day-to-day requirements of running the restaurants, including making their ashtrays, installing electrical meters, wiring, copying keys, making repairs, etc. And this is not common for restaurants, but this is more like what one usually sees in hotels. They also ensure that Baoluo has a capacity to extend itself and to grow organically when necessary and when the opportunity presents itself. So when Baoluo was undergoing its various expansions, they never once applied to the city government for any licenses at all. Not for changing the zoning permit from residential to commercial, and not for any of the construction work that was done. They approached various architects to help with the work, in fact some from Tongji University, but no one wanted to undertake it. So eventually he said, well, he told us when we were talking with him, he said, there's no way you designers can do it. This isn't design, it's not for you architects. Because no professional architect would bear the risk of doing the job. The first expansion involved undertaking huge structural changes to the original building, in fact removing the party walls themselves, while families continued to live in the floors above this construction. So no architects were consulted during the construction. It was just a group of contractors and the owner of the restaurant himself directing the work as the foreman. They also didn't bother to get government licensed contractors or bureaus to arrange for necessary electrical wiring or water pipes. They just went to the main sources at various points along the road and siphoned off whatever they required. So they had free electricity and water for many years. And it was only long after they'd finished construction that the government sent inspectors to investigate. And they were fined, and now everything's okay. Good. But we have to note that this is a real technical feat. Baoluo might look like a heterogeneous mess, but the simple fact of its existence is the result of a great deal of technical ingenuity. It's something of an engineering marvel in and of itself. So remember, this is a restaurant, and it's a Chinese restaurant. This is a very intense type of cooking which requires high temperatures and removing large volumes of air. It requires the ability to supply a good deal of material, such as water, gas, and to extract large volumes of grease and other waste. So you can see here the magnitude of the infrastructures. It's not a train station, but remember that these are being inserted into an early 20th century fabric that's hardly flexible. So the result is a kind of divorce between the exterior and the interior. In conventional modern architectures, there's supposedly an honest relationship between interior and exterior. The facade is supposed to be more or less a faithful representation of what goes on inside. What you see here in pink is Baoluo. What you see here is all of the rest of the existing urban fabric in which it's sort of embedded. It itself has a sort of amazing shape. I mean, it's almost like a kind of morphology that you can't identify. The facade is supposed to be a more or less faithful representation of what goes on inside, but at very least the general correspondence between interior and exterior volumes is expected. But here we see an interior that's come to be divorced from the larger building envelope. It merely does what it wants, or it takes advantage of what's available and affordable. The possibility of an architecture that divorces itself from its own exterior is usually expected of older architectures. I mean, we see this at times in the Baroque or in Charles Garnier's opera in Paris, but it's usually commonly associated with highly theatrical spaces. But what's so beautiful about Baoluo's relationship to its own exterior is that the interior envelope occasionally comes into contact with the building envelope, and at this point it takes on the form of a conventional architectural element, like we see with the gables. This is the case with these windows that we see on the upper floors. And the dining rooms actually occupy those spaces below the eaves. And these moments are where the interior and the exterior are actually isomorphic with one another, and they're quite occasional and glancing. And the intersection between the restaurant program and the available envelope makes for some very surprising rooms. But in general, the principle is that Baoluo is a kind of architecture where convenience produces a wild heterogeneity of contents. We see this with the roofscape. Here, the restaurant is using its own roof while expanding across the lane away from the main road. they're using this area to grow plants, actually some edible plants, as well as to provide balcony spaces for the private dining rooms. Some of the groupings and plants are screened by picket fences, as you see here. So, I mean, what do we make of all this? What we're showing here are a few instances of what we feel is a kind of an architectural ingenuity that is almost an architecture without architects, but is produced according to a very clear kind of logic, and has very fascinating and unusual results. And a lot of this, as you can see, is a very interesting willingness to occupy spaces temporarily, to take them over, to make them places of event and meaning, even if they're about to be shortly destroyed. We see this over and over and over again in the fabric, which is kind of being slowly eradicated almost up to one's doorstep, but at the same time, at one's doorstep, new additions and alterations are being made on a provisional basis. In terms of questions of design, we would very much argue that there is design at work here. Whether there are formalized designers at work is a question that we might discuss, but what's very interesting in these cases is how pockets of availability are made in a desperate attempt by people to keep themselves in the city center where their extant social networks, where their families are, and where they've lived for their entire lives. And when we compare this perhaps to the kind of triumphant monumentalism of what's happening elsewhere in urban China, perhaps this provides an interesting contrasting example. And maybe we can talk about that in smaller groups shortly.